Daniel Moriarty, the diverse local and regional stratigraphy of the South Pole Aitken Basin.
Thank you. So we've been looking at the diverse local and regional stratigraphy of the South Pole Aitken Basin. So I'm sure, as most of us in the room are familiar with, SPA is one of the largest and oldest well-preserved basins on the Moon. Due to its large size, the impact event may have melted or excavated mantle materials. Previous work has shown that the SPA interior exhibits pervasive mafic minerals and significant compositional diversity. So the overall scope of this project is to characterize the compositional diversity of SPA materials in order to constrain SPA formation and evolution, and by extension, large impact processes in general, and also look at the structure and composition of the lower crust and possibly upper mantle. That's a huge scope. So for this talk, we're going to be zeroing in on constraining some compositional diversity of the subsurface using some central peaks. And we're also going to be investigating the nature of mafic mound, which we found to be an unusual lithology within SPA. The tools we're using for this analysis are Moon Mineralogy Mapper spectra. So we're looking specifically at pyroxene minerals. Pyroxenes are very useful for remote sensing because they exhibit diagnostic absorption bands, which are related to the mineralogy and formation condition of the minerals. They're also very useful because they're pervasive across the lunar surface and exhibit a very strong optical signature. So pyroxenes exhibit diagnostic absorption bands at 1 micron and 2 micron. The band center composition relationship was most recently characterized in works by Klima et al. They had a suite of synthetic pyroxenes with well-controlled compositions that they then took spectra of and used MGM to deconvolve the absorption bands to find out the band centers. So when they plotted the band centers with the 1 micron band center on the y-axis and the 2 micron band center on the x-axis, they found that there was a very strong correlation with composition. So you have very magnesium-rich orthopyroxenes at very short band centers, transitioning to more iron and calcium-rich clinopyroxenes at longer band centers. So we'll be referring to the synthetic pyroxene trend throughout the talk, and we've highlighted it with this gray line here. So the MGM model I just mentioned is a way of using physically realistic band shapes to deconvolve absorption bands. And so to follow some of the interpretations we've made later in the talk, it might be helpful to understand a little bit about the physics of pyroxene absorptions. So pyroxenes have two octahedral cation sites, which are known as M1 and M2. So this is where your cations, iron, magnesium, and calcium live. Absorption bands arise when you have iron 2+ in the M1 and M2 sites. The M2 site is larger and more distorted than the M1 site. So the 2 micron band of the primary 1 and 2 micron absorption bands, the 2 micron band arises solely from iron in the M2 site. The 1 micron absorption band results from iron in the M1 and M2 sites. This is a superposed band. And iron in the M1 site also results in an absorption band at 1.2 micron, which is much weaker. So in general, in iron-magnesium pyroxenes, iron normally prefers the M2 site as it's a slightly larger ion than magnesium. Calcium is significantly larger than iron and magnesium and thus strongly prefers the M2 site. So in typical pyroxenes, most of your iron is going to be in the M2 site, giving you the 1 and 2 micron absorption bands. However, high calcium content, very high calcium content, can force some iron into the M1 site, giving you this 1.2 micron band. Rapid cooling of the pyroxene can also trap some iron 2+ in the M1 site, giving you this, again, this 1.2 micron band. So for pyroxenes of similar compositions, we see that a stronger 1.2 micron band can be an indicator of faster cooling of the pyroxene. So this MGM model is very useful when you have very high quality spectral data, such as laboratory data. But when we're working with remote sensing data that may be somewhat noisier, or if you're trying to work with many spectra at once, it's often useful to use a more simplified approach. So we've been developing what we call the PLC technique, which comes from the procedure of using parabolas and linear continua to characterize your spectra. So first we used a two-part linear continuum to fit to the spectrum. We remove the continuum and then fit parabolas to each absorption band to characterize their properties. So the properties we're most interested in are band depth, which is related to pyroxene content, and band center, which, as we just discussed, is related to the mineralogy of pyroxenes. When we compared the PLC band center measurements to the MGM measurements, we see that it agrees very, very nicely. However, when we look at natural pyroxenes, so this is a suite of HEDs that we've looked at with both PLC and MGM, we see that the PLC results in these solid triangles are quite offset from both the synthetic pyroxene and MGM trend. We think this is because of the 1.2 micron bands. So PLC, as just a single parabola, does not account for this 1.2 micron band, where MGM, you can deconvolve several bands. So when you account for this 1.2 micron band in MGM, you have a shorter wavelength, whereas when you use PLC, which does not account for this, it shifts your PLC measurement of the 1 micron band to longer wavelengths. So this is confirmed when we directly compare the measurement of the 1.2 micron band in PLC and MGM. So you see that this offset is almost completely contained in the 1 micron band, where the 2 micron band is very similar. So now that we've established and validated our spectral analysis techniques, let's dig a little bit into SPA. So South Pole Aitken is very large, and therefore it's mostly more useful to look at subregions using moon mineralogy Mafic data. So the subregions we've looked at here include central peaks, shown here. We've also looked at some Mare craters, shown here, as well as some non-Mare craters, shown here. So it should be noted that in both the Mare craters and central peak craters, we've looked at additional crater structures such as the walls, floors, and rims, basically for more context. So the total spatial distribution of areas we've looked at is shown here. So for each subregion, we calculate the spectral parameters. We extract all the pixels with band depth greater than 0.15. So what this does is this isolates the most pristine Mafic exposures in each subregion. We then apply a color stretch to these pixels based on the band center. So what we've done is, for short wavelength magnesium-rich materials, or pyroxenes, we've coded blue, and that transitions to red as you go to more longer wavelength iron and calcium-rich pyroxenes. So what this does is this allows us to identify spatially coherent units of similar composition. So for each unit we identify, we calculate an average spectrum of all the pixels, perform continuum removal, and then fit the parabolas, which allows us to get a 1 and 2 micron band center for each unit in each subregion. So when we look at all of these South Pole Aitken units together, we see that they follow the general pyroxene trends quite nicely. There is significant diversity observed in these South Pole Aitken pyroxenes, and there is somewhat of an offset, which, as we talked about earlier, might be due to that 1.2 micron band. For the remainder of the talk, we'll be focusing on this plot just in the region of South Pole Aitken materials. So when we blow it up, it looks like this. So now we'll dig into some of the specific exposures, so we'll start off at central peaks. Central peaks are very useful for remote sensing analyses because they expose material from depth beneath the lunar surface. So the central peaks in this study have exposed material from something like 10 kilometers depth. They're also very useful for spectroscopy because they resist the accumulation of soils on their slopes due to the very high slopes. So when we plot up all these South Pole Aitken central peaks that we've looked at, we see that they're generally dominated by very magnesium-rich pyroxenes. So they have these short wavelengths, which indicates a magnesium-rich composition. We also see that they fall into two clusters, at least what we've looked at so far. So we see that the short wavelength cluster is very dominated by very magnesium-rich pyroxenes, and there's an intermediate wavelength cluster which is dominated by pyroxenes somewhat richer in iron and calcium. When we compare to the rest of the non-Mare crater exposures in South Pole Aitken, we see that the non-Mare crater exposures exhibit a much wider range in composition. The central peaks are the shortest wavelength material, which means they're dominated by the most magnesium-rich pyroxenes in South Pole Aitken. And on the other end of the trend, we see that Mafic mounds in these darker red symbols and a few other Mafic exposures throughout SPA exhibit much longer wavelength absorption bands. So this indicates they have a much more iron and calcium-rich composition. This is actually a pretty interesting question. So what's the nature of these Nonmari materials, which are dominated by more iron and calcium-rich pyroxenes? So we compared the band centers of Mafic Mound directly to some of the South Pole Aitken Mare exposures. So when we do this, we see that the band centers are somewhat similar, meaning they have a somewhat similar composition. However, a lot of the Mare craters exhibit an offset from the synthetic pyroxene trend. To really analyze this in further detail, we have to look at the actual spectra. So when we do this, we show here Mafic Mound is the two red spectra, and an additional non-Mare high iron and calcium pyroxene deposit, Finson's Wall, is shown in orange. This is compared to the Mare exposures, which are shown in the other colors. So we see immediately that the non-Mare exposures exhibit a much higher albedo than most of the Mare. When we perform a continuum removal, we see that the band centers for the Mare and non-Mare materials are actually very similar. So this indicates that they have a very similar pyroxene composition. The main difference is actually in the 1.2 micron band. So Mare craters exhibit a strong 1.2 micron band, whereas the non-Mare exposures do not show evidence for this band. This is especially apparent when we remove some of the noisier basalt spectra. So you can see the significant difference between the 1.2 micron band for the non-Mare materials, which do not show this band, and the Mare materials, which show a strong 1.2 micron band. Since we believe that these pyroxenes have very similar chemical composition based on their similar band centers, that means that this difference in the 1.2 micron band must be due to the cooling history of the pyroxenes. So what this tells us is that the non-Mare materials cooled much more slowly than some of the Mare materials. Additionally, this 1.2 micron band being present in the Mare materials actually can move these the Mare band centers to longer wavelengths. So it's possible if you account for the 1.2 micron band, this will pull some of these wavelengths closer to the synthetic pyroxene trend and show an even closer composition to some of the non-Mare pyroxenes. So our conclusions: diverse pyroxene compositions have been identified across the South Pole Aitken Basin. Central peaks, which sampled something like 10 kilometers depth, are dominated by very magnesium-rich pyroxenes, but they do exhibit a significant range in pyroxene composition. Non-peak crater structures, such as walls, rims, floors, etc., exhibit a much wider range in pyroxene composition and are usually dominated by pyroxenes much richer in iron and calcium. Mafic Mound and a few other non-Mare exposures in SPA are dominated by a distinct pyroxene composition that's much higher in iron and calcium. These exposures exhibit a similar pyroxene composition as Mare basalts, but they are distinct from Mare basalts in that they do not exhibit a strong 1.2 micron band. So this indicates that they cooled very slowly. Thank you.
When you're talking about the central peaks, and you said, okay, well, one cluster is at very high magnesium, another cluster up here. Do you think that's just because you don't have enough samples to show a range, or do you think there's really two distinct compositions?
That's definitely something we have to look into more. We're only looking at like 7 central peaks right now. So once we start looking at more, we'll be able to tell if it's a continuum or if there actually is some clustering. And we want to look at like the spatial trends as well. But again, we need to look at much more peaks to do that.
Bill Bodke, Southwest Research Institute. I may not be remembering correctly, but I thought the Kagoya data suggested some central peaks in South Pole Aitken Basin had olivine. Is that true? And then is that, have you looked at any of those?
So from what I remember, they were talking about kind of very small olivine exposures on larger central peaks and crater central rims. We're mostly looking at pyroxenes, so we haven't seen too much evidence for any olivine. In the spectra, that would give you a very wide 1 micron band, and we don't really see much evidence for that in the areas we've looked at. We also haven't looked at the specific craters they were looking at. So once we look at those, we'll be able to have a better idea of what they're seeing versus what we're seeing.
Derek Sears, NASA Ames. Have you thought of any sort of experimental way of testing this cooling rate idea. Is this something you could do in the lab?
Yeah, so experimentally, we haven't done very much. There's a really excellent 2008 paper by Rachel Klima et al., which really goes into how the 1.2 micron band relates to cooling of pyroxenes and the iron partitioning between the M1 and M2 sites. That's a really great paper. One additional thing we've done is we've looked at pyroxene separates from lunar basalt samples. So your pyroxenes and lunar basalt samples, so that's just the separate just the pyroxene minerals, they all exhibit a pretty significant 1.2 micron band. And we know that that's just due to pyroxene and just due to iron in the M1 site. But yeah, it would be interesting to do some more experiments to exactly quantify how this effect is manifested. Thank you.